tayong mga eco zones dito sa Parañaque, lalo na mga IT parks and centers, and we need to grow more, no? So that will be another a separate story to tell in an appropriate time. So I am here together with my officers of the 1st Air Force Wing Reserve to invite the city of Parañaque to become a reservist unit under the Philippine Air Force. We base this invitation by virtue of the Constitution and the law creating the reservist program of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So in our Constitution, it says that the Armed Forces of the Philippines is composed of the regular and the reserves. So yung mga regular po, ito yung mga full-time soldiers. And because we can only afford to pay 20% as full-time soldiers, so nasa batas din po natin, kailangan 80% of the Armed Forces of the Philippines should be the reserve force. So one of the sources of our reservists are the ROTC graduates. Another source of our reservists are the elected and the appointed government officials. And the third sector are the captains of industries. So these are companies whose assets, like airlines, whose assets are air assets that could be helpful in times of war, emergencies, disasters, and calamities. So that is basically the role of the reservists of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. We will be the source of expanding the regulars in times of disaster, emergencies, calamities, in war, and even in nation building. So we are here this afternoon because under the law, there are 3 branches of service of the Armed Forces Reserve Force that we can choose to be with. And selecting the branch or which branch of service we want to become reservists thereat is based on the mobilization plans of the armed forces in times of emergencies and war. So for example, dito po sa Metro Manila, because we are near the airports, so it is advisable that those sources of our reservists, like the elected and appointed government officials, should be with the Philippine Air Force. Those other sources of our reservists who are in the rural areas, ideally should be with the Philippine Army, because that is where most of our brigades, divisions, battalions are located. And if the LGU or the companies are located along the coastal areas, so it is best that the would-be reservists should be or should join the Philippine Navy. So yun po, kaya kami as the commander of the Philippine Air Force of the National Capital Region, we are going around the different LGUs of Metro Manila to invite every LGU to join us in the Philippine Air Force to become a reserve unit. So we will request honorable members of the City Council a day. We have expressed this to Congressman and Mayor Olivares that maybe in one of your flag raising ceremonies, we can provide a longer briefing or an orientation. So for the elected and appointed government officials of Parañaque City can understand and we will be able to entice everyone to become reservists. So what will be our role once we become a reserve unit and the elected and appointed officials as reservists. So we will first fill up an application form. There is an application for commissionship. And the process is that it will be approved by the Commanding General of the Philippine Air Force. That it will be approved also by the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Secretary of National Defense. And the last to approve is the President of the Philippines, who is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. In other words, si Presidente po ang mag-designate sa atin at saka mag-approve sa ating appointments as reservists. So what is the initial rank for cabinet members or secretaries, justices of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, the governors, and the city mayors of highly urbanized cities like Parañaque. The initial rank will be Lieutenant Colonel. For the Vice Mayor, the initial rank is Major. And for the City Councilors, your initial rank is Captain. Captain. But if you have masteral degrees, PhDs, it will elevate your rank. You can be a lieutenant colonel. Okay? So why do we call it initial rank? Because there will still be another training where you can be promoted to full colonel and a general. So the succeeding training or educational requirement is for a lieutenant colonel to undergo the command and general staff course of the armed forces. So with that, you can already be eligible for promotion to full colonel and later as a general. That's how I got my commissionship. I happen to be one of the co-authors of the reservist law when we passed it in 1992. And the illustrious father, the late Roy Lugoles, was my colleague, the father of our former Vice Mayor Rico Goles. We were both co-authors of that reservist law. So now that the country is facing a lot of threats, natural disasters, calamities, and external and internal threats, the more that we have to tap our people to become reservists. Kasi hanggang 20% lang talaga ang kaya ng ating gobyerno na bibigyan ng sahod as full-time soldiers. Kaya tayo, in fact, tayo na, nahuhuli na tayo dito sa having citizens becoming reservists because maski yung mga superpowers like America, Russia, China, their citizens are really required to become reservists. So in the US, for example, they have two types of reservists, the Federal Reserves and the National Guards. The National Guards are by state. So what good can we get if we become reservists? First, we will have that opportunity to become a hero. And second and foremost is for us to show our love of our country and to be able to protect the lives and properties, not just of the country, but also of our people. So, pagkatapos pong magawa natin yung orientation, we will be passing around commissionship forms. And I mentioned that the final approval will be the President of the Philippines. So we will pass this to ROTC graduates and college graduates. Kasi pag college graduates, automatic na yan, you are qualified to become officers. And And if you are elected officials, like your honors, meron na pong corresponding rank per your position. So the first training that we will be doing is a 30-day training. But this will be conducted during weekends. So, dyan po, tuturuan kayo ng mga military skills. And to follow will be the skills on how to respond to disasters, calamities, and emergencies. So, don't worry please, no, because we will not be utilized for combat operations. Yung combat po, yung hahabol sa mga NPA, etc., ay trabaho po ng regular yon, yung full-time soldiers. So as reservists, that is the last that we will do, but it will not be during peacetime, but perhaps during wartime. Kaya one of the skills that will be trained as is how to handle different weapons. But what we are focusing now, because we are now in peacetime period, is to train the skills in disaster response. More on disaster, calamity, emergency response. So that's why we are very grateful for this opportunity na yung very elected officials, we were able to meet all of them, Congressman Olivares, Mayor Olivares, the Vice Mayor, and the City Councilors, kasi kayo po yung uunahin namin i-recruit. So, ipapadala po namin sa bawat isa ang application for commissionship. So, hope you will comply with those. May mga documents po na nire-require. Then once you are done, we will have to put a timeline para sabay-sabay po natin i-submit sa Air Force, then sa Chief of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the Office of the President. Para sabay-sabay po kayo mag-take oath sa Presidente ng Pilipinas. So yun po ang gusto kong ma-share. Again, I thank the good Vice Mayor and the City Councilors for this opportunity to present to you the reserve program of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and in particular, the Philippine Air Force Reserve. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much to our Brigadier General Shari.